Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on what the Weather Bureau says is going to be a wild and windy night in Melbourne. What a surprise. Again. Tonight we've got an interesting variation from our normal PowerPoint speaker program. I'll make up for that next month, don't worry. Tonight we're having a panel of Vietnam veterans, and I'd also like to acknowledge that there are a number of Vietnam veterans in the audience from different tours and different roles in Vietnam. We've even got a Korean veteran who was in Vietnam as well. So there's a very interested and no doubt knowledgeable audience tonight. Dr. Peter Edwards, the official historian for Southeast Asian conflict, will chair the session tonight. And before we go on, I have to apologise on behalf of Linda George, who was an entertainer in Vietnam, who was due to be here tonight. I know many of you will be disappointed, as I am, that she wasn't able to attend because she had pneumonia. So she does give her deepest regrets and apologies. Hopefully we'll have her back on another occasion in the coming months. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter, who is also the vice-patron, one of our vice-patrons here at the Military History Heritage Victoria. And at the end of the session, after Peter's dealt with your questions and engagement with the four panellists, I'll finish off the proceedings with thanks and tell you about next events. Thank you, Peter.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thank you all for coming out. As Andrew says, Vietnam is one of the most interesting wars, if one can describe it that way, one of the most complex and challenging wars, and it remains so even as we mark the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan. It was one of those wars, along with Korea, when the Cold War turned hot. You can still get a good argument as to whether it was really about communism versus non-communism, or was it about Vietnamese independence from all the nations that wanted to dominate Vietnam, or was it really a battle for hegemony over the Indo
was popping over there to see him, probably something unusual in a war zone. Anyway, my time ran out, and back to Bungtow I went, and I spent the last 2 months there again doing the heavy curfew patrol. But I much prefer curfew patrol to working what they call the bird there, where it's anyone in the army that mucked around, perhaps gave a sarge the clip under the ears or did something untidy, they'd end up with a week down at what they call the bird. And it was not a good place, and wouldn't have suited my temperament to try and work there and give people a hard time, but it was army discipline, it was there for a reason. Try and convince people not to play up too often. Anyway, eventually I was told, well, you're going home. So early '69, I made my way to Tonsanut and got on a C-130, which is a 4-engine AAF aircraft. And it flew to Penang. Sadly, there was 4 coffins on it, which wasn't good for morale really to come out with coffins. But it got to Penang, and the crew said, well, we've got time off. So we spent 2 days in Penang, wandered around Penang. We wandered around Penang at 11 o'clock at night. There was no one around, and we wondered why. Guess what? There was a curfew there. Something like that. But interesting place. Eventually, back on the plane, nice long flight back home. Personally, at that stage, I wouldn't have minded if I had come home on a tidy night. But within 1 month, back in the blue uniform, back on patrol on Swanson Street. Interestingly, it cost me half my wages that I would have earned in the 2 years, which is an interesting point. Our wages weren't made up. Other departments did, but Victoria Police didn't, for one reason or another. And the other interesting little point, and I've still got the receipts and I've shown a few people and they just can't believe it, is that we actually paid the difference between second-class rail and second-class air to fly home from Sydney. An interesting one. But I've got the receipt to prove it. People had heard about it, and they didn't have the proof. I've got the receipt. So the only other thing, because the 10 minutes will be up for sure, was that I did find it perplexing on the 4th of July 1969 to find myself outside the American Embassy having marbles and excluder and stuff thrown over me. I thought, I don't believe this. History tells the rest. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Australia was the only so-called third country, in other words, the only ally of South Vietnam and the US, to send forces from all 3 services, although it was overwhelmingly, in numerical terms, an army commitment. But we have now somebody who served in 2 other services. Ken Busting served in both the RAN and the RAAF. Joining the Navy in January '64, we joined HMAS Duchess and sailed with Vendetta for 6 months, operational duty as part of the Far East Strategic Reserve during Confrontation, and then as escort to Sydney, to HMAS Sydney, en route to and from Vietnam. So for 34 years altogether in the ADF, 10 years regular Navy, 12 years regular Air Force, and 12 years active Naval Reserve until discharged as Lieutenant in 02. Ken Busting.
Good evening. As the only representative of the senior service, I hope I do justice. My experience in Vietnam, I'm sure, will be very different to my colleagues here. The Navy were involved on operational when we left Australia, really, in the 60s. 60 Far East Strategic Reserve, it was called. And we got deployed in different areas, so we were under a high threat basically all the time. So that's why my visions of Vietnam ain't great, because it was just to me it was like serving in Vietnam. It's not much different to serving in Borneo. But anyway, I'll start my story. Here I am as a young 18-year-old. I just graduated from SIG school, and as the date shows there, it was visual signals, semaphore, which you probably did at scouts or guides, flashing light, flags, and VHF radio. We also did cryptography and a few other things like that. How do I move this on, please?
Just with the pointer, push the button, one of the arrows to yeah.
Okay, so soon after joining the Navy in '64, I during my recruit training, actually, I'm sure you've probably heard that the Voyager was sank by the Melbourne, and 82 sailors were killed. The class in front of me were actually on board that, and because one of my colleagues, my cousin, Dustin, was on that, everyone at home thought I was on it, so, but he did survive. But that had actually repercussions to me, because little did I know that the Royal Navy in their generosity would give Australia a replacement ship, which should have stayed in the mothball fleet where it was, as far as I'm concerned, and I think most of the crew at Duchess would say later. Anyway, that's moving on a bit. At this stage, after graduating from recruit school, I was posted to HMAS Sydney, and this is just before Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam was starting, but it was very low commitment at that stage, and the Indonesian Confrontation was just starting, and the Sydney was made ready for its first troop deployment, operational, to take troops to Borneo. There was and reinforcements to Battalion at the airbase. So we were, no one really knew what we were doing. The ship was just sort of, it was very old. It was an ex-aircraft carrier, so it wasn't really organised for troops at all. So my recollections of that trip was we were still sleeping in hammocks, very old Navy, unair conditioned. When the soldiers moved on board, or the army, we had to go to work during the day, and they had plenty of time, so they'd come down and grab our hammocks, and we had nowhere to sleep at night, so I used to sleep on the forecastle, which was on deck, just with a pillow. So when they left the ship in Borneo, that was good. We got our bedding back. So that was the forerunner of the Vietnam time, just leading into that, and that's what Vietnam meant. So then after this tour on Sydney, I came back and finished my SIG training, and then I was posted to the Duchess, the ship I mentioned earlier, replacement of Voyager. And as I mentioned, that had come out of reserve. It was unair conditioned, open bridge, pretty well, by Australian standards, pretty primitive. It was a daring class destroyer, one of the last of the gunships. So had 6 4.5-inch guns. Had 2 Bofors. It was meant to have 6, but they'd taken 4 off in anticipation of putting a missile system on, but they never put the missiles on. They just took the gun off. So typical. So it was. I think everyone was on the run there. It was Vietnam. We were all fairly stretched, all the services. So that was my introduction as a signalman. So we then were deployed to Far East Fleet, and that included service in Malacca Straits, Borneo, and Vietnam on escort to the Sydney. So the ship also, as you might be able to see in the picture, had an open bridge. And I was a signalman, so we spent a lot of time up on the bridge. So we're out in the sun all the time. There's no protection, no such thing as sunblock or hats or anything like that. Just wore shorts, actually. The other ship that went with us was an Australian ship, Daring Class 2, Vendetta. But it was chalk and cheese. They were air conditioned. We weren't. They slept in bunks, and covered bridge. So we were quite envious of those guys. There I am as a young signalman. Photo taken. That was a 10-inch lamps, which I should have mentioned. Once we left Australia, It was all in radio silence, so there was no radio used except occasionally VHFs. Most of it was like signal, flags, like Lord Nelson would have been proud. So that made us very busy. And once we left Australia and we were operational, we went into State 3, condition Yankee, I think. I'm a bit rusty on the terms. That meant instead of normally at a sea you'll have about 20% of, everyone works during the day, but out of hours about 20% of the ship's company are on duty. When you go to a higher state of readiness, you've got about 40% of the ship's company in readiness. So you might have a gun crew closed up. Signalmen, we used to have one on deck, but because we were operational, we had 2 on deck. So we had 6 signalmen, so you work during the day, then you work during the night. So it was a lot of fatigue, and as I say, the messing, the conditions were dreadful. And we often ran out of fresh water. We just have salt water showers. We had to go and collect our meals up in the galley, carry them down through the ship, down the stairs into the mess to eat them. It was real old Navy, even for the 60s. So, but it was a good experience, and we all survived. One of my duties as a signalman was to go away in the sea boats, and that's an example. I'll talk about this in a few minutes. But they're a step up from the whale boats that you've probably heard about, chasing whales, Montague whaler. They come back from, I think, Nelson's day too, a way ago. Anyway, this was a version of it. They had motor whalers, so they stuck an engine in it, but it was much the same vessel. So 27-foot whaler. It could row and sail, but I think no one ever tried it. It was so heavy. But that was we didn't have helicopters, so we did ships transfers at sea. This particular shot's taken when we were going on the Far East. There was ships coming back, so we transferred some officers across ourselves. I later spent quite a lot of time in this boat, so that's why I mentioned it. That's just a shot of troops boarding the Sydney. And there's a shot of Sydney at sea. So the next, I left Australia in August '68, and in September, mid-September '60, same year, we were deployed to Manus Island, and we refueled, came in and they had some entertainers out there. One of the, I think the people on their way to Vietnam, so we had a good relaxing night, lots of sports. And then immediately after that, or just before, I can't quite recall, we joined the Sydney as a convoy. So it was the Duchess and Vendetta. The Navy, because I mentioned before, Indonesian Confrontation, although it was never reported, it was a real, for the Navy point of view, it was just one step short of a hot war. We were anticipating submarine attack, and I sort of knew it because I was in the signals. If you were a cook, you wouldn't have known any of this, unfortunately. And because the Russians were in the area, and there was a lot of debate whether they'd actually intervene in the Vietnam-Borneo campaign. They were also manning submarine, Indonesian submarines. So it was a real possibility of attack. And they'd only have to take the Sydney out. That probably would have been the finish of Australia's deployment. So it was a tempting target. So, you know, in those convoy duties, we were pretty well closed up at action stations, or one state below, which was over half the crew manned. All the hatches were closed. You just had a tiny little escape hole to get in and out. You had to juggle your food through that. So it was fairly tough conditions and no air conditioning, so imagine how hot it should be. So we picked up the Sydney, and to avoid submarines and other Cold War adversaries, we sailed around north of Philippines and came through Subic Bay, refueled, then on to Vietnam. That was, the Sydney, the HMAS supply ship along the way did meet us. I think they were just after Manus Island, refueled there. There I am on duty on the signal deck. That was during one of those races at sea. You can see there was 3 signalmen on duty there. There's a shot of the Sydney. Although I wasn't on the Vietnam run, the same as when we went to Borneo, the troops particularly the Army, loved boxing, so they had lots of boxing competitions and shooting competitions. I guess it was good to build a, a spirit of corps, etc. So, it's another shot of the Duchess. And this shot is when we were in Vietnam. At last I got there. So it was in Van Cao Bay, and it was about half a nautical mile off the shore. So it was the ship, the captains and the crew were pretty nervous because we were within mortar range, rocket range, and they also it was highly likely we'd be attacked by mines or frogmen. And again, it was the second trip to Vietnam, so everything was a learning curve. We were on the second tour with the troops. So you can see the Duchess and the Sydney at anchor there. I was deployed there again on the boats, I mentioned before. We ran continuous 24/7, running our boats and the Sydney and Vietnam boats around, dragging grapnel hooks and dropping scare charges and breaking up debris. And the idea was, we had an SLR and 9mm or something. The idea was to shoot any frogmen. We had armed sentries, and the first night I remember one of the guys from Mount Massey was on duty with a Bren, I think it was, and he opened up on a coconut or something. So they then took the ammunition off the saddles. So they saw something, they had to go to the officer, watch, get the ammunition. So I think it defeated the whole purpose. And that just shows one of the islands of just where we were close in the mouth of the Saigon. While we were there, the USS Preston did an 8-hour bombardment of that island or that area, and there was constant strafing because the VC, it turned out, had quite a big tunnel maze on that island. So why they didn't try and take out the Sydney, I don't know. It would have been an easy target for them. Anyway, fortunately they didn't. That's one of the jolly green giants, the caribou, not caribou, the rusty one. Yeah. That's the soldiers. They're always, we used to say in the military, hurry up and wait. So you spend a lot of time panicking and then you sit and wait. And that's the troops waiting to go ashore. So, just flying through this a little bit. After we left port, we were at anchor for 3 days. There was some debate about sailing on the second day and then coming back in because the ship's captains were so nervous about being attacked. But then they had to work out that would increase double the time in port, so they decided to just keep on all the operational states ready and take the risk, I guess. When we left Vietnam, we stayed with the Sydney because of the submarine risk right until we went down to about New Guinea. We dropped it off then. We then went back on patrol with the Indonesian Confrontation in Malacca Straits. Just one quick story there. I remember one night coming down the Straits, an Indonesian missile patrol boat locked on his missiles on us, and we locked on our guns on there, and we went there the whole night, just with gun crews closed up. And in the morning at 6 o'clock they made the pipe, patrol boats just peeled off, which was pretty fortunate. After that we went to Hong Kong for Christmas, and we were supposed to be in there for 10 days, but miraculously we were there for 3 weeks because the stokers got onto the engines and made sure we couldn't leave port. That's our Christmas party. Motley crew. After that we went on deployment to Borneo and then subsequently back on Malacca. And came back in late March, early April, 66. That's my story.
Thanks very much, Ken. And now our last speaker will, I'm sure, be very well known to you as to many people outside this room. Bruce Davies saw operational service in South Vietnam in part of every year between 1965 and 1970, partly with 1 RAR, with the training team. He was mentioned in dispatches, received a commendation for distinguished service. He's had several foreign awards, and was appointed an MBE. And he is, in addition, the author of several historical accounts of the war. So he's both as a soldier and as a historian. We welcome Bruce Davis.
Thank you and good evening. I too have lost a tooth. I'm going through a tooth implant procedure, and I tell you, it must keep the dentists in the life to which they've become accustomed. I am probably going to skate over the top of Vietnam very briefly because of time constraints. And I'll start first of all with 1 RAR, even though the training team had arrived in 1962, in July, August 1962. I'll talk a little bit about them later. But 1 RAR was the first Australian Infantry Battalion to be deployed to Vietnam. And just prior to their deployment, the battalion was pentropic in size. That is, it had 1,200 men in the battalion, and it was commanded by a full colonel, a colonel and a lieutenant colonel as the executive officer. It was a very unwieldy battalion size for operations in Southeast Asia. It was based on the American pentropic divisions that fought or were planned to fight in Europe. Everything was based on 5s, so we had 5 companies, 5 rifle companies in the battalion. Every second soldier had a Land Rover, I think. I remember the water platoon was something like 2 and 92 in support companies, so it gives you an idea of the size. Colonel Dunstan, who went on to become the governor of South Australia, was one of the commanders. Colonel Pearson was another one of the commanders. And Albert Morrison, David Morrison's father, was one of the operation officers. Now, the battalion had split and formed tropical warfare. It is downsized to 800. Because quite strangely, at that stage, we had a battalion in Malaysia. It was on tropical warfare establishment of 800. But back in Australia, we had 2 infantry battalions on pentropic, 1,200. So when they rotated, they had to reduce in size to replace the battalion in Malaysia. So about, I might be fudging some of the dates a little bit, but let's say March-ish, thereabouts, the battalion was starting to split into 2 to form 1 RAR and 5 RAR, who were based at Holsworthy. Now, word was out that something was going to happen, something was underway. Stores were appearing from out of storage area. The quartermaster was counting more stores. The senior officers were mumbling amongst themselves. And then we went to do the Anzac Day parade in Canberra, where the CO and a couple of the senior majors were taken aside and told that you're probably going to deploy to South Vietnam. At this stage, really, all of us, we did not know, but we knew something was on. You get the feel that something's on. However, we were then given 7 days pre-embarkation leave, and as we got out the gates to escape on our 7 days pre-embarkation, the taxi driver said, "Oh, you're the guys going to Vietnam, mate, are you?" We then sailed on the Sydney on the first trip, leaving on the 27th of May, sneaking out of Sydney Harbour, all black and silent. The families weeping up on the foreshore somewhere. They were not allowed to come down to farewell the ship. And I distinctly remember the Duchess during the trip up. She did a very fast run past us at one stage and lost a carly float, I think they called it, over the side. And she came up alongside and the signals were flashing, and the fellow said, "I've got to go back, I've lost a carly float. May I peel off or leave station or something?" In a way, went back into the distance looking for this lost float. We arrived then off Lung Tower, off the northern tip of Lung Tower, and we were allotted to the 173rd Airborne Brigade. which is an American brigade coming out of Okinawa. It only had 2 infantry battalions, so it was a bit of a lopsided brigade. But brigades are normally 3 battalions. And in the run-up to putting the Australian battalion into Vietnam, there were several locations that were considered for the battalion to be deployed. One of the first ones was up on the demilitarised zone, where the United States Marines had started to move in. Another one was further down the coast, in the vicinity of Queen Yuen, Triangle, somewhere along there, and that was to operate as an independent battalion, but that really was never on the cards because the Australians could not support the battalion logistically. We didn't go to the DMZ because there wasn't enough space there. There were no conditions available up there to put the battalion in. And thank goodness, as things worked out, we didn't go there. So we were put into Ben Hoa, which is about 30 miles to the north of Saigon. There's a major airstrip there, and we were put on the northeastern side of the strip. Major John Essex Clark was the OC support company, was an advance company. He came in and selected an area which was denuded of rubber trees, and we were sitting out in the sun area. And Butch Williamson was the commander of the 173rd, and he said, "What the goddamn hell are you guys doing? Why don't you get in under the shade like all these other good American boys down here in the rubber plantations?" And he said, no, we're going to sit out here and we're going to put in our defences and make certain that we're not susceptible to any local attack. We then had to structure the battalion to match the American organisation. At that stage we didn't have operations officers, and the American formation was S1, S2, S3, S4 and so on. We had adjutants and OC support company and 2OC, and although we spoke a common language, we didn't really understand each other. What happened was OC support company became the operations officer, and so he sat in the back pocket of Colonel Lou Brumfield, who was the commanding officer. We then moved in. An argument, minor argument I suppose, persisted at that time as to what can you do, what can you Australians do, what are you permitted to do? And we were limited initially to about 25 kilometres north of Ben Hoa Strip. We weren't to go any further than that, and we were only there to protect the airstrip. We weren't allowed to go into operational status at all. That soon became unworkable as it soon came to the fore when the brigade was moved up to Play 2 to conduct an operation we were not permitted to go. So that didn't go down very well with the Americans at all. In our settling in period, at this stage in Australia, I think there were about 4 or 6 Huey helicopters. In our settling in period, Williamson came over and said, well, you can do a very small operation to set themselves in, get a feel for the area, and let's say run it over a few days. So you've got 50 helicopters. What? You've got 50 helicopters. But goddamn, you better give them back. And suddenly the enormity of the American involvement in this area struck us. This is unbelievable. The helicopters, attack aircraft, artillery, it was just mind-boggling to Australian soldiers who had come out of running around Tin Can Bay or places like that. It was just unbelievable. So, just to give you an idea, here I said 50 helicopters. The total losses of helicopters for the Americans during the war, Hueys, was 3,305 destroyed. There were another 1,436 helicopters destroyed. For example, there were 260 Cobra attack gunships, 83 Chinooks, and a wide variety of other small helicopters. So there's over 4,700 helicopters lost from 1964 through to 1975. On top of that, they lost another 3,339 fixed-wing aircraft, attack aircraft. It's just mind-boggling, the expense, the cost of it all. The operational differences also caused the Australians some concern in that we thought the Americans were a bit gung-ho, they were very brash. They were, okay, here we are, come and get us if you wish, and we'll just blow you away. Whereas we were tending to operate more along the lines of the Malayan emergency. We were sneaking around in the jungle, trying to follow paths, get out of the way, moving very slowly, trying to keep quiet. And the Americans called us pussyfooters. It was a bit of a nagging slang at us as to the way we're operating. We then had to fit into some of their operational manoeuvres that really we didn't agree with, but after a while we understood. They tended to use firepower rather than manpower. So if you come across an enemy position or enemy location or suspected enemy location, then we're just going to dump a lot of artillery, a lot of attack aircraft on it, and then we'll go in and clean up the bits after. So if you're coming in to do a landing in a particular area, air mobile operations, the area would be prepped by attack aircraft, then artillery, and then the gunships would be herding you down the side as you came into land. And during one of those operations, we had a rather interesting experience because as we landed and the artillery moved on to prep the next strip, one of the gun batteries remained fixed on where we had landed and dropped about 15 shells amongst us. Surprisingly, no one was hurt, no one was injured. There was lots of dust and lots of swearing and cursing and radios being blasted with telling the guns to stop. And I distinctly remember to this day the commanding officer of 5 RAR, Lieutenant Colonel Ward, coming through the dust with his peak cap on in his polyester uniform with shoes, carrying a briefcase. And I was lying there trying to dig a hole with my nose. And I started to laugh because it reminded me of being on an exercise back in Australia with the umpire coming around saying, right, you're dead, you're wounded, right, picking him up and moving him to one side. It was just, I think the people around us started to laugh and diffused the situation immensely. We soon adapted very quickly to the use of American firepower. Don't believe the stories that we didn't know how to use it. Once we were given the opportunities to use it, we used it. Don't believe the stories that we didn't count bodies. We counted bodies as much as anybody else did. And in the battalion headquarters at Benoit, we had a blackboard. Every time we came back from the operation, the numbers were flipped over on the blackboard. But can you imagine going in operation, getting engaged in a firefight, and the commanding officer saying, okay, what happened? Well, I've got 1 dead, 3 wounded. What about the enemy? Oh no, we don't count bodies. Like, we didn't count bodies. Of course, the difference between the two organisations then came to the fore when we started to expand our effort in Vietnam. As one, I think it was Bruce White, the Minister, the Secretary of the Department of the Army, said, on one side we had Vietnamese, on the other side the Americans, and we decided that we needed to go somewhere else. And that's when we established, or went to establish a position down at Nui Dat, to the north of Vung Tau. I won't speak about the task force area because I didn't serve there, only to say that the area in which the task force was established, in my opinion, suited the Australian method of operations very well. It was more counterinsurgency type warfare to the level that the Australians were capable, and their experiences gave them the opportunity to practice to their benefit. If we had moved, for example, to the 4, if you look at the map, to the 10 most dangerous provinces in Vietnam, the first 5 from the demilitarised zone down, Quang Tri, Tra Tien, Quang Nam, Quang Tin and Quang Ngai, and then Binh Binh. And On the spine, you have Kontum, Pleiku, and Malacca. And then to the south of Saigon, you have Bintang and Ken Hoa. They were the 10 most deadly provinces in the war. The war was not constant throughout Vietnam. It wasn't one war. It was a different war there, to a different war there, to a different war there, and a completely different war across the demilitarised zone. In the demilitarised zone area, the enemy had heavy artillery on the northern side, firing across the demilitarised zone. They were up to 152mm in size, 130mm, 152mm, and rockets 122 and 140mm. Some of those artillery guns outshot the Americans. They had greater range. It was not uncommon when there was trying to establish the fence across the demilitarised zone. The demilitarised zone was 10 kilometres wide, 5 kilometres to the north of the Ben Hai River and 5 kilometres to the south. When McNamara was talking about putting in fence, which are fences, mines, radar, reaction forces, etc., they built certain base areas across the southern area on which they were going to pin the fence, and it just became impossible. The North Vietnamese were bombarding the bases with artillery every day, up to 100 shells a day at least, in many areas. In some areas, the attacks were followed, the NBA attacks were preceded by artillery bombardments of 700, 1,000 shells. The enemy were using flamethrowers. It was a completely different tempo. Up around Long Bay, which is to the west in Quang Tri province, they used PT-76 tanks to overrun the Long Bay Special Forces camp, and also down in Ben Phet in the Central Islands again, they used PT-76 tanks, and 700 rounds of artillery fire preceded an attack. So now, if I may just talk about, just a little bit about the casualties. For example, in February 1968, there were 879 Marines killed in I Corps in 1 month. 879 killed in 1 month. That's just in I Corps. That is not the entire conflict. That's an indicator of the difference in tempo. The other area where the Australians served, the AATV, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, majority in I Corps, the first 5 provinces, and then some of us moved down into Special Forces locations, excuse me, in the Central Islands, operating out of Pleiku, patrolling to the west towards Laos and Cambodia. If you want to go to an interesting American briefing, okay guys, load up, go out there and get it. Okay, so I was young enough and stupid enough to think that that's what it was all about. I think, as I said, I really skated across the top of our involvement beyond the main area of Vietnam that many of you understand and appreciate, which is the Phu Tri province. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've gone a little over time, but I think you'll agree with me that we've had 4 very interesting and different perspectives on it. And I think you'll bear with me if we carry on a bit longer, and I would like to throw the floor open now for questions, comments, which you can direct either to any one of the speakers, or if you have a question that can be answered by all 4, by all means do so. Microphone here, which will...
I don't think I need microphone. Bruce, you mentioned the locals.
Yes.
How loyal were they? Were the Montagnards loyal to us, to the Americans? And the second thing is, you mentioned the Pentropic organisation. Was that Lieutenant General Sir Ragnar Garrett's introduction?
I'm not sure. There probably was. There were great George Hughes or whatever, he said that he argued against it. But it wasn't really, it probably was, Peter could probably answer, it probably was Gareth's idea. The Vietnamese were very loyal to us. I do not recall at any stage feeling that I was endangered by being with a Vietnamese unit. And I think they probably had directives to make certain we looked after the stupid advisors. Don't get them killed, because we were the links to the attacking aircraft, the artillery, or their medevacs, and so on. Now, some people say, how come the advisors receive so many awards for gallantry and so on? I think, I have a theory, is that because in an ardent battalion there were 350 Vietnamese, and there were 4 advisors, 3 Americans and an Australian, and you lived embedded to come to with that unit wherever they were. And when you went on operations, that were basically nearly an operation all the time, even though you sometimes sitting on top of a hill somewhere, you would have someone with a lead company. You're always with a company. So I would be with the lead company with a radio operator, or the other fellow would be back with the CO and someone with the other company. So when it hit the fan, so to speak, you're almost always in that front area, so that you could get in contact with, tell them what's going on and where to direct the airstrikes or the artillery or whatever. And so that is my theory, that because you're always there, and they tended to congregate around you. They came to you like babies to mummy. You'll look after me, won't you? The boneyards, again, didn't have a problem. There were boneyards that were not loyal to the American side, but those, we have Rade in our area, but they were fairly loyal. Some of them didn't want to fight, but they were then sacked or moved out because they started under the CIA program, who paid for them. Then the American Special Forces came in and took it over. And our base was at the end of the Playview Strip, and we still had our CIA weapon station there. You could get here whatever you liked if you were stupid enough to have a few drinks before you went on operation. Sometimes silly people like myself would take a shotgun instead of something a bit more suitable. They were very, what do you call, almost naive in their beliefs, their lifestyle. Aboriginal hill tribes. If I can tell an amusing story, I'd been there for a little while. We were doing operations out towards Laos, and then an SAS captain came from Australia to come into the position to command the company, and of course he's so used to the jungle, and they moved 500 metres a day. So there we are with 80 mott yards. Yabba, 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 yabba. Bloody hell, get the quiet. Next to there's this enormous gunfight. What the bloody hell's going on? Find out what's going on. Oh, they found the deer, sir. They're chasing the deer. Unfortunately, they used them incorrectly. Initially, it was to reconnaissance. And they were fine. They knew the area, they knew the trails, they knew where people could be moving. In certain ways you could get through the hills. I'm out there at 3,000 feet, 4,000 feet, and sometimes you're on the ridge line, if you fell off the side, you'd slip down to the bottom and find your way back up again. So they knew where they would come. Then the next thing, you were to be ready in action for the ACAMs that were sprinkled. There were several of them sprinkled along the highland areas. Then they moved them into light infantry battalions, which was a complete disaster because they didn't get the support, they didn't have the weapons, and so when you clashed with a major enemy force, you were in deep shit. And there's no other way to describe it.
That young captain wasn't John Murphy, was it?
No, it was right behind.
Jim, you mentioned escorting prisoners of war. I'm assuming they were all, in your experience, VC rather than NBA. And my question is, what were your impressions? Okay.
Fair enough. Most of the time they would have been either detainees or VC. The detainee is someone that the infantry have picked up outside the wire, they're in the wrong area, but they might have been trying to collect food or something. So they'd be brought in question. If they were found that they're only locals, no detainees, we'd end up actually having to run them back to the village, let them go, which is fine. If they thought they were VC, then they were interrogated by our people, and then they were then taken by helicopter to Long Bin. Didn't see too many NVA in Futui ourselves, although once we got up to Coral, they were all NVA.
What were your impressions of them?
Probably like any unfortunate that's captured. The odds are against you and you just go on quietly because the odds are there. They would have been petrified at rides in helicopters because no doubt they heard stories. I didn't see anything like that occur myself, but you could imagine you possibly could. They were usually bound and blindfolded, so it was pretty scary for them. And if you're guarded by a shotgun, which we had at Newry Dad, no one argues with a shotgun.
I might just mention at this stage that earlier this year, a Vietnamese person, Natalie Nguyen, who's an academic at Monash University, published a book called, quite simply, South Vietnamese Soldiers, which is one of the best books that has yet been written on their war, the Arvin War. To a large extent, it's based on interviews with former Arvin soldiers who are currently in Australia. Natalie Nguyen, as I say, lives here in Melbourne. But it's a very useful account, and it fills in a blank. And there are shelves and shelves of books on the American War, and a few now on the North Vietnamese War. But there's been almost a total blank on the actual on what Arvin was actually like, and it corrects a few of the myths, I think, that circulate about that army. Anyway, other questions or comments that you may have from the floor?
I know this is, you've been giving us a very vivid impression of the small picture, the nuts and bolts, so this may be a bit unfair, it's essentially a big picture question. What did we learn from the experience?
My response to that would be our politicians learned nothing.
Well, I think, frankly, we sometimes look at it the wrong way around. We're looking at it in 2016, and we're all experts looking in the rearview mirror. We've got to go back to immediately after the Second World War. And the people that were involved in making these decisions were not idiots. If you get people such as General of the Army, Omar Bradley, senior generals from our own staff and from the UK, who were also involved in the discussions. Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, and what were I think also Marshall was still around, or if he wasn't around, he was certainly being asked questions about how best to handle what they saw was an area fraught with danger of spinning off into a communist world. And at that stage, of course, China and Russia were monolithic communism, even though they fractured later. And interestingly, of course, as in today's papers, they're talking about Russia and China coming back together again and threatening the United States in that particular region. Now, frankly, I'm of the opinion that people knock the domino theory simply because it didn't happen. Doesn't mean to say that it wasn't going to happen. And the other thing that I think a lot of people misjudge is that they thought it was just military in essence, whereas it was also an ideological, economic battle that was taking place. And if you read some of the discussions from Mao Zedong when he was telling his foreign minister, whose name escapes me at the moment, about how to influence 600 million people in the region by isolating America. You then start to get a feel for what was happening and why we were so fearful about it. And one of the fears also was the isolation of Australia. We've seen the things if you like now in the South China Sea of isolating those trade routes through the South China Sea. One author wrote recently, it's not the falling dominoes now, it's the billiard table. The South China Sea is the billiard table and China is the white ball, knocking all the other balls off the table. So I think we've got to look at it from back there rather than up here saying, oh, well, what a stuff up. And perhaps one of the other things, in my view, that I see, really Australia is paying an insurance policy, keeping within the American security umbrella. I think that's a fairly valid way to be approaching it. Okay, let's do some pretty dicey and dicky areas, but you either believe it, you either believe in the security of your nation, or you might as well roll over and put your tongue out.
I agree, Bruce, on that last thing, because who's going to come to our rescue each time. But also, it was probably learned that you can never win a war if you can't stop supply, and supply quickly stop. It's also very difficult to win a war in the people's own country, in that part of the country. It's nearly impossible. And the other thing too, of course, it went too long, then you lose your own people back home. So there's no support. And the politicians change their mind. That's history.
I think one point that always comes up in these sorts of discussions is still worth remembering the longer, all during the war and long afterwards, one of the strongest supporters of the American, Australian Allied intervention was Lee Kuan Yew. So as somebody, I think it was Robert Thompson, said during the war, you believe in the domino theory, well, ask the dominoes. And Lee Kuan Yew and Singaporean governments ever since have never resiled from the argument that the Western intervention delayed the fall of Saigon by 10 years. South Vietnam would have fallen almost certainly in 1965 had there not been that massive intervention. It actually fell in 75. And if you look at what happened to the rest of Southeast Asia in that 10 years, if you compare the position of Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia in 1964-65, and compare it with the situation when Saigon did fall in 75, there's a vast difference. And that mattered to Australia.
But comment, I find those answers most revealing, and I too agree with what you said. The interesting thing, none of you mentioned the Malaya emergency. Now that was an important step for Australia, and the other thing was that at that time, Australia took politically substantive steps to allocate the land as capital territory with the incentive, or close to New South Wales, Charles Bay, for a nuclear reactor. It was actually set aside. If you go there, you can see the site in its infancy. But it was later, for a variety of reasons, that step was withdrawn. It's a very interesting time.
Okay, I think we might wrap it up now, but I would ask you to join me in thanking very much our four speakers.
Now, Bruce, I know I'm almost certain that you've got a book called Ted Sarong in your library. On behalf of the committee, I'll give you a small So you've got about appreciation, particularly for the Navy and the Air Force people. And for your grandchildren, perhaps. Bruce, thank you very much. I also have a small hand of applause for Peter Edwards as the chair. It struck me when I was preparing this night that I was saying to the President Marcus that I should have put myself in the panel because as a young teenager I followed the war avidly. Had scrapbooks and cut out things from newspapers and Life magazine and so on, and joined the army as soon as I could. Had a brother in Vietnam in '71 with the SAS and was just itching to go. Then they closed down the war, which was probably a good thing for me. But it's interesting that for all the experience sitting at this table, there was a lot of experience in families, both the people left behind, the loved ones, and families who also had the experience of their loved ones being in a war zone. And I know my youngest brother, who's sitting in the audience here tonight, can tell the story of my eldest brother coming back from Vietnam, sleeping in the family home and having nightmares and certain energetic reactions to being disturbed during his sleep, shall we say. So it's a war that affected many people, not just the combatants, of course, but also the families and others surrounding the people that were there. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time tonight. I'm sure everybody enjoyed that immensely. I certainly did. Finish up, just to tell you about what's happening in the next couple of months. Next month, I put myself forward very humbly to do a presentation on the Australian signallers that worked in Mesopotamia, Persia and Kurdistan, a place which we now know, of course, as Iraq, Iran and Kurdistan in modern times. But in the period in the First World War, right through to November 1919, when D Troop of the Australian Signal Squadron in Mesopotamia came back to Australia, the last formed AIF unit to return to Australia. And one of the soldiers in that signal troop was a fellow called E.K. Burke, Eric Burke, who was also a professional photographer. His grandson lives here in Melbourne, and I've had the pleasure to work with him putting on an exhibition which opens next week in Mount Waverley at the Highway Gallery about the photographs, because E.K. Burke took a tremendous amount of photographs professionally while he was there as a soldier. So I'll be talking about E.K. Burke's experience in that interesting period of 1918, 1919, working in those strange areas that we know so well today, but at that time was really quite esoteric. In October we have an author coming to speak about the soldiers who enlisted in that first rush after the news of Anzac in Australia. So we're going back to the First World War. And then finally in November we've got our one-day conference on Saturday the 12th of November. Yes, of November. In the Bag, which is a conference about the POW experience of Australians from 1915 to 1945, where we'll break some new ground. Sorry?
And internees.
And internees, yes, there's a bit of that as well, absolutely. So that's our program for the next couple of months. We hope to see you again. Please keep in touch with us as we bring more of our military history and heritage to the Victorian people and the Australian people at large. Thank you very much for coming.